How many moms have been treated special this morning already? Got a couple hands, all right. How many had breakfast in bed? Any breakfast in beds? Any promises of breakfast in bed, but it just didn't pan out that way? No, none of that? Heard a story of a husband who was trying to be good for his wife on Mother's Day, and he made the mistake of buying her an iron. On Father's Day, he got an ironing board. I read this little thing there and I thought I'd share it with you this morning. It's a list of things that moms would never say. All right? How on earth can you see TV when you're sitting so far back? Just leave all the lights on. It makes the house look more cheery. Let me smell that shirt. Yeah, it's good for another week. Go ahead and keep that stray dog, honey. I'd be glad to feed him and walk him every day. I like this one. Well, if Timmy's mom says it's okay, that's good enough for me. The curfew is just a general time to shoot for. It's not like I'm running a prison around here. And here's a good one. I don't have a tissue with me. Just use your sleeve. And don't bother wearing a jacket. The wind chill is bound to improve, all right? Things mothers wouldn't say, all right? Abraham Lincoln said this. He said, "No man is poor who has a godly mother." That's some pretty good quotes from Abraham Lincoln. I believe he was a saved man. John Wesley said this. He said, "I learned more about God from my mother than all the theologians in England." We can learn from our moms. I learned lots of things from mine. I'm sure you've learned lots of things from yours. And I wrestled this morning with which mom I would preach on. Which mom could we look at this morning and get encouragement from to do things more God's way? And, you know, there are some good moms in the Bible. There are some bad moms in the Bible. When I say bad mom, there's two that pop to mind right off the hop. The one is the one that came before Solomon when they were arguing over the baby, and she says, go ahead, cut him in half, all right? Not a good mom, all right? And an even worse mom. She was a grandma, Athaliah. Remember what Athaliah did? She killed all of her grandchildren so that none of them could be king and she could be queen. And to top it all off, how bad she was, she missed one of them and didn't even notice for 7 years that little guy was growing up. You know, it was a good thing, but she is a bad one. But you know what? This morning we are going to look at one of the great ones. One of the great moms that put God first, and we're going to see that this morning as we spend some time. I want you to take your Bibles and come with me, if you will, please, to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, and I'm just going to read for you to start with the first 5 verses. It says, "Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who were very bad news, by the way, but nonetheless, they were there. The priests of the Lord were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb." I want you to notice, first of all, we look at Elkanah and we think, well, he must be from the tribe of Ephraim. He was not from the tribe of Ephraim. He was actually from the tribe of Levi. He was a Levite. But the Levites didn't have a portion of land that was allotted to each of them as they were to Reuben and Simeon and Judah and Dan and Naphtali and Asher and Gad and Zebulun and Issachar and all the rest of them, okay? They didn't. The Levites were dispersed out through those. And if you were reading, as Brother Wayne and I would have been reading this week in our Bible reading, some of the chapters that people dread to read, all right? And so begat so-and-so, and he begat so-and-so, and this is the son of, and the son of. You would see there, these are important chapters, although sometimes they can be tough to sled through. I'll give you that. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, it shows us where Elkanah came from, and he was a Levite, all right? And he may have even been coming as he went to Shiloh, it may have even have been his turn to do some things on an annual basis, to do some sacrifices, because as we see there, that he gave these portions, all right, of the sacrifice to his wife, both wives, and the children of Peninnah. We see here, too, that when in verse number 2, and it says, and he had 2 wives, the name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah, and it's generally thought that Hannah was his first wife, all right? He was his first wife, and the thought is there, and there's nothing else to back this up other than a maybe, all right? The thought is there because Hannah couldn't bear children, that Elkanah decided to get a second wife that could bear him children, and had Peninnah. Now, I'm not absolutely positive about that, but that seems to be the order that is there. And we need to understand something here, that this is during the time of the judges, all right? And as we see that as time progressed through, you know, there was things that happened, and then there was Moses that led Israel, and there was Joshua that led them after that, and so forth. And then they had a time of people that were judges. And what characterizes the time of the judges is Judges chapter 17 in verse 6. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Everybody decided what was right to do in their own eyes. And we see here that although even prior to this, there was people that were polygamists. They had more than one wife, but during the time of the judges, it went on because people did what they wanted, all right? There is much that speaks about of polygamy in the Old Testament. We know that Abraham had Sarah, and Sarah didn't have any children, and Sarah convinced him to take her handmaid Hagar, and he married her, and he had 2 wives. And then Isaac didn't. Isaac only had 1, but Jacob had 4. And if you remember the account of Jacob with Rachel and Leah, actually Leah was first and Rachel, and then Bilhah and Zilpah, it didn't turn out that well, okay? Because that's not God's design. If we were to look in, and we're not going to go there, but if we were to look in Mark chapter 10, we would see that Jesus is telling people that, you know what? From the beginning, it was one man with one woman, and the 2 became one flesh, all right? And so polygamy was not in God's plan, and so much happens outside of God's plan. It's interesting, I was reading in Mark Twain, I'm sure everybody's heard of Mark Twain. He was having an argument with a Mormon and about multiple wives, because some Mormons have many wives. Brigham Young, you've heard of Brigham Young University? Brigham Young had 87 wives, all right? Not as many as Solomon, but still he was going to keep Hallmark birthday cards going pretty well there, all right? But he was having this argument, but Mark Twain was having this argument with this Mormon about why you shouldn't have multiple wives and so forth, and the Mormon finally got upset with him. He says, you show me one verse in the Bible where it says you shouldn't have more than one wife. So Mark Twain quoted him Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No man can serve 2 masters. All right? That's what he said, all right? But at any rate, okay? Anything, understand this, anything that we do that is outside of God's design is going to fail. Even if we think, well, this is a good idea to have this, And lots of people have come up with good ideas. Let me give you one good idea. I was going to say Pentecost. It's not Pentecost. When Passover came, the people came from all around Israel to bring their sacrifices, all right? And some of them would have to travel long distances. And I mentioned this before, that the population of Jerusalem just exploded when it came time for Passover time, because people were coming there. And because they had to travel such long distances, it wasn't practical for them to look through their farm and see, okay, well, here is a spotless sheep, okay? Can't have a spot, it can't be limping, it can't have a bad eye, can't have a bad ear. They got to be the most perfect sheep that they can find. And then to travel all that way and something happens to the sheep, and oh man, now I've got nothing to sacrifice. So what they decided to do was people would travel long distance, and they would take some money with them, and then they would buy these sacrifices once they got to where they were at. That sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? But the problem is they decided to sell these things inside the temple, and they were ripping people off. But even that, Jesus, when he cleansed the temple, he says, you made my house a den of merchandise. That's not what it is, all right? But it started out as a good idea. And so it doesn't matter if it starts out as a good idea or not. When we step outside of God's design, disaster can happen. And we see that here. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. We have Hannah and we have Peninnah. And look, the third word of verse 6 says what Peninnah is. It says, and her adversary also provoked her sore for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, she went up to the house of the Lord. So she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. She's called an adversary. I mean, again, we can just see that it didn't work very good here in this situation either, to step outside of God's design. And that's what happens. That's what happens. So why? Here's the question. So why? We see there in verse 5. It says, but Hannah, he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. Why did God shut up her womb? Why did God hold back from Hannah what she wanted so dearly, to having children? Why? There's others that God shut up their womb. God promised Abraham a son when he was 75 years old. And when he hit to be about 86, they decided to try another thing there and have Hagar have this child, because clearly Sarah was not going to. But it wasn't until Abraham was 99 that God opened up Sarah's womb, and she was, I believe, like 89 at the time. All right? But why did God make Sarah wait so long? Sarah had Isaac. Isaac, in essence, is the father of all of the Israel, other than Abraham. Started from Abraham, but it comes from Isaac. The whole nation of Israel came from that promised seed that God made Sarah wait for. All right? We have Rachel. Rachel was the beloved wife of Jacob. He got stuck with Leah. All right, to begin with, that was not his plan, but that was his father-in-law's plan. And once he was in that plan, that's where he should have stayed, but he did not. And he also had Rachel, and Rachel could not have children. And there was another fight quite similar to between Peninnah and Hannah, between Leah and Rachel. And Leah had 4 sons to begin with: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then there was some others that she had as well. But that's when Rachel started to step in and say, hey, marry Bilhah. And then she had a couple of kids. And then Leah says, well, if you're going to have those, then it was a battle, all right? But what happened why did God make Rachel wait? Rachel finally had a young man named Joseph. And Joseph essentially saved the lives of numerous nationalities, all of Egypt, Israel, from the 7 years of famine. We see that God also shut up another lady's womb in the New Testament and made her wait. We have a lady named Elizabeth, and her husband's name was Zacharias, and he was a priest. And they were well past the time of being able to have children, and then God says, you are going to have a son. And Zacharias doubted what was going to happen, and the angel said, okay, well, you're not going to be able to talk until he's born now. But the boy's name was John. He is John the Baptist, the forerunner, the one who was promised to say, there comes one after me, all right? And he makes a promise of Jesus. So each one of these, God made them wait. We see that Samuel, who's going to be born to Hannah, Samuel's the one who anointed David to be the king, whose lineage Jesus came through. But why did he make them wait? Who likes to wait? Anybody like to wait? Anybody like to get in the bank and you see the line is just forever? And the people that are up there are chatting about the weather. Doesn't that drive you crazy? They're sitting there. You're sitting here. Come on, let's go, like this. And they're up there. Oh, isn't it a nice day? Yes. And the teller's there. Yes, it's a wonderful day. Oh, I just love the sunshine and the flowers. And come on, get out of the way, right? But we like to wait. We don't like to wait. My father-in-law, bless his heart, boy, if he got into the waiting room in the hospital, it was not pleasant for anyone else in the waiting room in the hospital. He did not like to wait, all right? But sometimes we have to wait. In Psalm chapter 27 and verse 14, God's word tells us, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Amanda put that to music, and we sing that some Sunday nights. Wait on the Lord. There was a farmer, and he found his little girl, not his little girl, but this little girl was lost in one of his meadows. And the farmer said to her, don't cry, I'll take you home. And the little girl just snuggled up to him with a big smile, and she said, I knew you would come. I was waiting for you. And the farmer looked at her, and he said, you waiting for me? What made you think that I was coming? And she says, I was praying that you would. And he said, you were praying? He says, when I first heard you, you were saying A, B, C, D, E, F, G. What was that all about? And she looked up at the man. She said, I'm just a little girl. And I was praying all the letters of the alphabet and letting God put them together the way that he wanted to. He knew I was lost, and he knew how to put them best together. Don't you wish you had the faith of a little child sometimes? Hannah was discouraged. Hannah was beaten down. She was the target of abuse. Clearly, in her eyes, she would think of herself as being the issue why she couldn't have children. Because Elkanah had Peninnah, and they had lots of kids. So it had nothing to do with Elkanah. It had to do with Hannah. It was from God. But in Hannah's view, she would think that she has some kind of deficit as a mom. She was discouraged. When you allow anxiety to take over, when you allow that to consume your thoughts, to consume who you are, it will sap all the strength out of you that you have for going. It will. Let's take a look here at verse number 8. It says, Then said Elkanah her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. Now Eli was the priest and sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. Hannah was left really with a choice, as we are. When things come before us, when problems present themselves to us, when things happen, we have a choice. Hannah had a choice to either remain depressed, remain downtrodden, or to leave it with God. George Mueller said this. He says, the beginning of anxiety is the end of faith, and the beginning of faith is the end of anxiety. George Mueller had an orphanage and to read through the story of how God provided for him over and over again, can understand this guy's got some wisdom and some closeness to God. In Psalm chapter 61 and verse 1, it says, Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. Luke speaks of Jesus, and he says this in chapter 18 and verse 1. He says, And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. We ought to pray. That ought to be on the tip of our tongue all the time. Whether that prayer is that we see something that we can glorify God and we can praise God for, or whether we need help with something, we can ask God for that help. That ought to be our knee-jerk reaction. God is there. He said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. You know what? He's right here. He's in this room. He's with you if you're all by yourself. God is there. But we treat him so often like he's not there. But he is. He's holding us together there. All right? And Hannah here, she decided that she's going to trust God. And I want to show you some really neat things here. As I read through this passage, something jumped out at me that obviously I've read a million times, but it really jumped out at me. And I'll get to that in a minute. I'm just kind of baiting the hook here for you. But look at verse 11. It says, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. What it's talking about there about the razor coming upon his head is she was putting him forth as a Nazirite, someone who is dedicated to God. Samson was a Nazirite. He was a bad Nazirite. He broke every part of that there's three things that a Nazirite wasn't allowed to do. A Nazirite was not allowed to cut their hair, okay? A Nazirite was not allowed to touch anything that was dead. And a Nazirite was not allowed to have anything to do with what came off the vine. They couldn't eat grapes, they couldn't drink grape juice, they couldn't, any of that kind of things. And Samson blew all three of those things. But and some people would take a Nazirite vow. Those ones were, Samson and Samuel were Nazirites from birth. Some people would take a Nazirite vow for a period of time. And it's not something for us to do now, all right? Just understand that. But they would take a Nazirite vow for a time before God, and then they would abstain from these three things altogether, and just, it was almost like a time of fasting. And there was qualifications for that and what they had to do for that. But she was promising to give Samuel to God. All right? Got a news flash for you. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. You know, we look at it sometimes and we think, well, man, I messed up there, and we're going to mess up as parents. We are. Anybody here got a perfect track record as a parent? Nobody jumping in the fire there, all right? There's no such thing as a perfect parent, but you know what there should be? Praying parents. Praying parents. Parents willing to get on their knees, weeping before God for their kids, for their grandkids, for their great-grandkids, and for their parents. But we should be praying parents. At first, she felt shame, as I mentioned. She felt shame for not being able to be a mother and give children to her husband, whom she loved and who clearly loved her. He said, am not I better than 10 sons? He loved her dearly, and she felt shame for that, although it was no fault of hers. It was no fault of hers. But she felt the burden of it. But through this trial, through this waiting period that she had, she learned some things. She realized that the blessing of the child was not about her. That's how it started. Her shame and her being rebuked and her being picked on by Peninnah. But she realized that it wasn't about her. It was all about God. And what she's making a promise here is, if you give me him, I'll give him back to you. For not just for a little time, but for his whole life. So she's not going to have him. All right? And she makes that promise. Instead of keeping this blessing for herself, she is willing to give him back to God for his whole life. You know, it's amazing, and Ian has mentioned this to me a number of times, but it is amazing how often when we make a solid commitment to God, when we decide we're going to do something for God, and we put our faith and trust in God, and we make it known that we're going to do something for God, Satan gets right in there, and the trials begin. Here's Hannah. Here she is. She is on her knees pleading with God. She goes in there with verse 10, and she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. She goes into there weeping before God, and then she makes the commitment. God, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. And what happens while she's doing this? What happens while she's doing this? Satan tries to throw curveballs. He'll discourage us. He'll cause us to doubt. He'll cause us to second guess and try to make us quit. Try to make us not do that commitment that we've made to God. But look at verse 12. It says, and it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put put away thy wine from thee. John Bunyan said this. He said, in prayer, it is better to have a heart without words than words without heart. And I have witnessed this myself through the many years of being in church and growing up in church and seeing where someone will say something or someone will do something and it is little and it will offend someone and they'll say, you know what, I'm out of here. And they'll pack up and leave. And you look back and you think, this is crazy. But Satan tries to cause division from within. And he'll throw a little thing at you that shouldn't affect you at all, but it does. And it hurts your feelings or it catches you the wrong way and people say, you know what, I'm gone. If that's what that church is going to be like, I'm out of here. And here she is, on her knees begging before God, and here's the man of God, the high priest says, you drunken sloth, you, what are you doing here, doing like that in here? And she could have said, well, you know, if you're going to treat me like that, I'm out of here. But that's not Hannah, all right? Didn't matter what the curveball got tossed at her. She says, I'm going to do this. If we were to look through here and read, we have read out some of these verses already, but if you were to look from 11 down to verse 18, Hannah calls herself a handmaiden 5 times there. That's the bottom of the totem pole as far as the social status goes, just to be a handmaiden. She's humble. She's humbling herself and she just wants to do what's right. I want us to pay very close attention to the change in Hannah. This jumped out at me. And the change in Hannah from before she made that promise to God to after she made that promise to God. And we're not talking a long time here, all right? She's on her knees before God, but we see here in verse number 7, it says that she was, and so she rather provoked her, and she wept. In verse number 8, it says that it talks about Hannah, and says, why weepest thou? We see in verse number 9, it talks about her, verse number 10, and she was in bitterness of soul. There's how she was until she said, God, this is for you. I'm giving it up. If you give him to me, I will give him back to you. And look at verse 18. This is a beautiful verse. And she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. Talking to Eli after he had called her a drunk. So the woman went her way and did eat, and look at, her countenance was no more sad. Her countenance was no more sad. That changed. Did she have a baby yet? No. But you know what she'd done? She'd given it to God. She gave it to God, and though she was provoked, though she was weeping, though she was sore from all of that, when she gave it to God and said, this is yours, she was no more sad. There's a change. There's a change. Why? Because her trust was not a hope-so kind of trust. Her trust was a confidence, much like that little girl in the meadow, knowing that somebody was going to come along and help her because she prayed to God. The principle here is that we need to be willing to give our families to the Lord. How much, think of this, how much of a disservice would it have been to Samuel if Hannah had kept him back? How much of a disservice would it have been to him if she'd have said, she had him for probably, it was until he was weaned, and they breastfed their children a lot longer than we do now. So and by the time the cycle was back around for them to go back to Shiloh to worship, in fact, he was probably like 4, all right? Between 3 and 4 years old. You know how cute a 3 and 4-year-old kid is? We got a 4-year-old granddaughter. I can't imagine just handing her to some guy who's already proven to himself that he's a terrible father because Hophni and Phinehas were evil people. I can't imagine that. She's just the sweetest little thing, I tell you. But you know what? She kept her word because she trusted God. And even in that polluted atmosphere of Hophni and Phinehas, God overruled for Samuel. It says that Samuel let none of his words fall to the ground. And it says the people knew from Dan, which is the far north of Israel, to Beersheba, which is the far south of Israel, they knew that he was going to be the next prophet. All right? But she was willing to give him up. If we were to look at and my time is fleeting, so I'm not going to, but the first 3 verses, I'm going to read them anyway. All right? Of chapter 2, Hannah prays. Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoiceth in the Lord, mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. Talk no more exceeding proudly, let not arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. There is, in this little section here, 8 times in these 3 verses, she says it's about God. She mentions God's name, or talking about him as thy name. It's 8 times in there. In verse 2, it says, neither is there any rock like our God. Our God is a rock. Not a stone like we see outside, but it figuratively. And I realized that phrase is in the Bible several times, so I thought, I'm going to look up all the verses that talk about God being a rock. And then I'm going to read them to you today. There's too many, all right? I started listening, that's a good one, and then, that's a good one, and I'm going to read a couple to you. Psalm chapter 61 and verse 2 says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee, when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. There's a song. We should learn that song called Lead Me to the Rock That is Higher Than I. I wonder where they got that song from. Right from this verse, all right? But it talks about God being a rock. And then I saw this verse. This is a great verse. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 31. For their rock is not as our rock, even our enemies beside themselves being judges. You know what? Our rock is true. Notice in that verse, it's even got a capital on the R, on the rock. Because our God is a great God. Thought it was interesting in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 2, it says neither is any rock like our God. But in 2 Samuel chapter 22 and verse 2, all twos, it's talking about David, and it says, and he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. That's David talking. And as far as the Lord is my rock and my fortress, David tells us that in 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 2. He says the same thing in Psalms chapter 18 and verse 2. He says the same thing in Psalm chapter 31 and verse 3. And he says the same thing in Psalm chapter 71 and verse 3. The Lord is my rock and my fortress. And Hannah said the same thing. She said, neither is there any rock like our God. He's called a rock because he is dependable. He is dependable. He is my fortress because he is the only real place of safety that we have. This great woman of faith took her eyes off of her dilemma, took her eyes off of the fact that she was being ridiculed by this Peninnah, this Peninnah, all right? And took her eyes off of her and put her eyes solely, fixed them onto her rock, her God. That's what we need to do. We need to keep our eyes on God. And just like when Eli threw that out there and said, look at you drunk, you shouldn't be here, and she just let that roll, we should let it roll when some things like that may happen to us, and we may be a little bit offended, but we got to trust God. Because we're here to serve who? We're here to serve God. Are we here to see friends? Sure, but number one reason is we're here to do what? Worship God. All right? Because God is our rock. And we are going to sing a song in just a minute, A Shelter in a Time of Storm. All right? And it starts right out in the very first verse, the very first words, the very first verse. It talks about about God being our rock. We can trust him. We should trust him. We should trust him with all that we have. Just like Hannah here, in absolute sorrow, in bitterness of soul, and when she finally just gave it to God and got up from there, and Satan sure threw that thing there with Eli, and what did she say? when she left. She told Samuel there, or rather Eli, and she said, "Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight." So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad, because her trust was in God. Was in God. Let's pray. Precious Father, thank you